The morning of the auction, there were 700 eggs that nobody wanted. They sat in shallow cardboard flats behind the livestock barn at the county fairgrounds, stacked 4 flats high on a warped folding table, and they were priced at nothing because the man who had brought them there could not even get people to take them for free. A hatchery down near the state line had gone under that spring, folded up quiet the way small operations do, and these were the last of what it left behind. Nobody knew for certain what breed they were. The paperwork had been lost or never kept. The incubators had gone cold for 2 days during a power failure, and the general opinion among the men leaning against the fence rail was that whatever might be inside those shells was already dead, and that anything still alive would hatch wrong. A tall man in a feed store cap named Del Prather said it plainly enough for everyone to hear, that you could not build anything from a pile of cold eggs from a dead hatchery, that it was throwing good time after bad, and that whoever bought them would be feeding buzzards inside of a week. He said it as a joke, and the men around him laughed the low, easy laugh of people who are sure they are right. And it was into that laughter that a young woman named June Holloway walked, 23 years old, sunburned across the back of her neck, and stopped in front of the table and did not say anything at all. She looked at the eggs for a long time. She picked up one flat and turned it slowly in the light, and then she set it down and picked up another. She did not haggle, because there was nothing to haggle over. She said she would take all of them, every flat, and she counted out what little she had for the fairgrounds handling fee, and Del Prather said, loud enough, that he hoped she liked the smell of rot. Before we go on, do me a small favor. Tap that like button if you believe the thing everybody laughs at is sometimes the thing worth the most, and leave a comment telling me the town or the city you're watching from, because I read every one of them, and I want to know where in the world you are while you sit with this story. Say it in one word if you like, just the place. Now, let's begin. June Holloway had come back to Caldwell Hollow in March, not because she had a plan, but because there was nowhere else that was hers. Her great-aunt Verna had left her the farm the year before, 61 acres of ridge and bottomland with a house that leaned toward the creek and a barn that had outlived 3 roofs. June had spent her childhood summers there, and then had gone away the way young people go away, to a city 300 miles east, to a job stocking shelves overnight and an apartment with a window that looked at a brick wall, and none of it had ever quite become alive. When the letter came about the farm, she did not so much decide to return as stop resisting the pull of it. She loaded a truck that had belonged to her uncle, an old 3/4 ton that ran rough and burned oil, and seemed on cold mornings to be composing its own obituary in the driveway, and she drove west into the hills until the road turned to gravel, and the gravel turned to the 2-rut lane that led up to the house. Verna was not dead. That was the thing people got wrong when they told the story later. Verna was 91 and lived in a small brick place in town near the Methodist church, and she had given June the farm early because, as she put it, she was tired of paying taxes on ground she could no longer walk. But Verna's mind was clear as creek water in October, and her hands, though spotted and thin, still moved with the economy of someone who had spent 80 years doing exactly as much as a task required and not one motion more. She wore men's work pants and a canvas coat and rubber boots without any self-consciousness at all, because she had earned the right to wear whatever kept her warm. And when June came to see her that first week back, Verna looked at her over the rim of a coffee cup and said only, "So you came back?" And June said she had. And Verna nodded as if that settled a long-standing argument between the two of them that had never actually been spoken aloud. The farm had once been a working place. June's great-grandfather had kept it, and his father before him. And there had been in those years a poultry operation of some size, back when the hills were full of small flocks and the eggs went out on the train to the cities. But that had ended before June was born, and the long, low chicken houses had fallen in on themselves, and the incubator shed at the top of the pasture stood empty with its shelves furred in dust and its windows gone to spiderweb. June had walked up there her first week home and stood in the doorway and looked at the old wooden incubators, the big cabinet kind with the glass fronts and the copper trays, and she had not known then why they held her attention the way they did. She only knew that she stood there longer than she meant to, and that when she left, she pulled the door shut behind her carefully, the way you close a door on a room where someone is sleeping. It was Verna who put the idea in her head, though Verna would never have called it that. June had driven her to the fairgrounds that morning in April for reasons that had nothing to do with eggs. There was a farm consignment sale, tools and fencing, and the odd piece of machinery, and Verna wanted to look at a hay rake somebody was selling, though she had no field to rake and no intention of buying. It was simply that a sale drew her the way water draws a dowsing rod, some old instinct of a person who had spent a lifetime measuring the worth of things. They were walking the aisle of the livestock barn when they came upon the table of eggs and the ring of men laughing, and Verna stopped. She looked at the flats the way June would later look at them, in silence, for a long beat. And then she said something under her breath that June almost missed. She said, "Those old cabinet trays up home would still run if a person cleaned them." June asked her what she meant. Verna did not answer directly. She picked up one of the cold eggs, held it up to the gray light coming through the barn's high window, and turned it slowly, and she said that the shell was speckled, faint brown flecks on cream, and that she had not seen a shell marked like that in 60 years. Then she said the thing that June carried out of the barn like a stone in her pocket. She said, "Your great-grandfather kept a bird nobody around here has kept since the war." And she set the egg down and would say no more about it. Only that if June had a mind to make a fool of herself, this was as good a way as any. That was how Verna gave permission. Not with encouragement, which she considered close to lying, but by naming the risk plainly and then declining to stop it. And so June bought the 700 eggs, and Del Prather made his joke about the smell of rot, and June loaded the flats into the bed of the truck with a care that made the watching men laugh harder, packing straw around each one, driving home at a crawl so slow that a pickup behind her leaned on its horn the whole length of the county road. She did not hurry. She had never seen the point of hurrying past something fragile just to save a few minutes on the far end. The incubator shed took her 4 days to make right. She swept out 60 years of dust and mouse nest and the brittle husks of wasps. She washed the copper trays in the creek and set them in the sun. The old cabinet incubators were the kind her great-grandfather had built himself, or bought second-hand and rebuilt, oak frames with hand-cut glass and a system of water pans and wicks that held humidity without any electronics at all. Only a thermostat wafer of ether-filled brass that expanded and contracted with the heat and tripped a small damper. June did not fully understand how they worked at first. She understood them the way you understand a language you heard as a small child and then forgot, the shape of it familiar before the meaning returns. She found in the bottom drawer of a workbench in the corner of the shed a notebook. It was bound in cracked black cloth and swollen from damp, and on the first page, in a cramped, careful hand, was written a name she recognized, her great-grandfather's, Elias Halloway, and a date from before the Second World War. The pages were full of numbers, temperatures logged twice a day, humidity readings, dates of setting and dates of hatch, little notation she could not decode, abbreviations and symbols, and here and there a full sentence in that cramped hand, observations about weather and about the behavior of certain hens. And near the back, on a page by itself, underlined twice, a line that June read a dozen times that first night sitting on an overturned bucket with a work light hung from a nail. It said, "The speckled birds are worth the trouble the others are not. Tell whoever comes after." She did not know yet what it meant. She held that line the way Verna had held the egg, turning it in the light of her mind, and she copied it into the front of a fresh notebook of her own, because it seemed to her the kind of thing a person ought to write down. She set the eggs in 3 batches over 3 days, so the hatches would come staggered and she would not be overwhelmed if any of it worked. She had read every page of the old notebook and everything she could find besides, but there was no substitute for the doing, and the doing was mostly waiting. She turned the eggs by hand 5 times a day, top to bottom, exactly as Elias had noted, marking each one with a pencil X on one side and an O on the other, so she could keep track of which had been turned. She kept the water pans full. She watched the brass wafer thermostats through the glass fronts of the cabinets and learned their moods, learned that the shed ran cool at dawn and warm by mid-afternoon, learned to crack a window when the sun came full on the west wall. She candled the eggs at day 7, holding each one against the beam of a flashlight in the dark shed, looking for the spider in red veins that meant life. And this was the first time the thing everybody knew for certain turned out to be wrong, because most of them were alive, not all. She pulled the clears, the eggs that showed nothing but a floating yolk shadow, and there were perhaps 130 of those, and she buried them under the apple tree without ceremony. But the rest, better than 550 of them, showed the fine dark web of veins, and, if she watched long enough and held still enough, the faint pulse of something at the center. She wrote the number in her notebook, 553 living. She did not tell anyone. When she went to the feed store in town for chick starter, Del Prather asked her how the rot smelled, and she said it smelled fine, and he laughed, and she paid for her feed and left. She did not argue. Arguing, Verna had taught her without ever saying so, was a way of borrowing trouble against a debt you had not yet earned. The eggs would speak for themselves or they would not, and either way her opinion of them changed nothing about what they were. The first hatch began on a Tuesday in the middle of May, 21 days almost to the hour after she had set them, and June sat on the floor of the shed through the whole of that night with the work light dimmed and did not sleep at all. The first pip came a little after 10, a tiny star of cracked shell no bigger than a grain of rice, and then a hairline, and then the slow turning of the chick inside as it worked its way around the shell in a spiral, resting, working, resting again, the way Elias had written they would. She did not help them. She had read that too, that a chick that cannot free itself is a chick you do not want to keep, and though it went against everything in her to sit still while a small living thing struggled, she sat still. By dawn there were 40 of them out and drying, and by the second dawn nearly 200 damp gray scraps that fluffed into gold and rust and speckled brown as they warmed, staggering on new legs, and June moved them a few at a time into the brooder she had built from a stock tank and a heat lamp, and she counted every one, and she wrote the numbers down. Over the 3 staggered hatches, from the 553 living eggs, she brought off 491 chicks. That was a hatch rate that would have been respectable from fresh eggs of known parentage in a modern machine, and it was very nearly a miracle from cold abandoned eggs of unknown breed from a dead hatchery, and June knew this, though there was no one she could tell who would understand what it meant. She told Verna. She drove into town on the 3rd day with a chick in a shoebox, one of the speckled ones, a little female already showing the fine dark flecking on her buff down, and she set the box on Verna's kitchen table and lifted the lid. And Verna, who had held her tongue about the whole enterprise, looked into the box for a long moment. Then she reached in with one spotted finger and touched the down between the chick's wings, very gently, and she said, "Well," and her voice was not quite steady, "those are the ones." June asked her, "Those are the ones what?" And Verna said, "Those are the ones your great-grandfather bled for." And she would not explain further that day, only wiped her eyes with the back of her wrist as though a bit of dust had gotten into them, and said the coffee was getting cold. The chicks grew through June and July, and as they grew, June began to understand what she had. They were not any breed she could find in a book at first, not the Leghorns or the Plymouth Rocks or the Reds that everybody kept, and she spent evenings on the sagging front porch with the old notebook and a library book on poultry breeds trying to match them, and it was Verna, finally, who named them. She came up to the farm one Sunday, walked the pasture where the growing birds ranged loose, watched them a while, and said the word as if it were a name she had not spoken in a lifetime. She said they were called the hollow speckle, though that was only what the old people around here had called them, and that the proper name, if it had one, was lost. She said Elias had kept a strain of them going for 40 years, birds his own father had brought over the mountains from further east, birds that laid a dark speckled egg and grew slow but grew right, and that the meat of them was different from anything a person could buy. She said the word different, and then she said it again. Built different, she said, and something in the way she repeated it made June write it down. During the war, Verna said, and after, when everybody wanted birds that grew fast and cheap, the speckle went out of fashion, because it took near twice as long to bring one to weight, and a man could not compete selling a bird that cost twice as much to raise. So the strain died out, flock by flock, all through these hills, until Elias was the last man keeping them. And when he got too old to keep them, he had done a thing that nobody understood at the time. He had sent his last several dozen eggs down to a hatchery near the state line, a man he trusted, with instructions to keep the strain alive if he could, and the hatchery had kept them, quietly, a small line among its commercial breeds, for all these years, until it too went under. And the eggs June had bought for nothing off a table at the fairgrounds, the eggs Del Prather said would feed buzzards, were the last of Elias Holloway's speckle in the world. June did not know, when she started, how a person turned 491 chickens into anything but a great deal of feed bought and a great deal of work done. She only knew that she had 'em, and that they were the last of their kind, and that this fact laid a weight on her she had not asked for and could not put down. So she did what Verna did, what Elias must have done, which was simply the next thing that needed doing, and then the next, without looking too far up the road. She raised them through the summer on the pasture, moving them in a low wire pen she pulled a few feet each morning so they always had fresh grass and clean ground, the way the notebook described, and they grew, slow the way Verna promised, feathering out into the strangest and most beautiful flock anyone in the hollow had seen. The roosters came in with tails like poured bronze and hackles the color of old pennies, and the hens went a soft speckled buff, and every bird among them carried that faint dark flecking that Verna had recognized on the shell that first morning. People started to notice. You cannot keep near 500 birds on a hillside beside a county road without people noticing, and pickups began to slow at June's gate, and men she did not know leaned out windows to ask what in the world she was raising up there. She told them the truth, that they were an old breed, and mostly they laughed the way Del Prather had laughed, because everybody knew there was no money in a slow bird. Everybody knew the meat outfits down in the valley grew a chicken to butcher weight in 6 weeks, and June's birds would not see butcher weight before the leaves turned. Del himself drove by one August evening and pulled in at the gate and looked at the flock for a while and shook his head and said the thing that the rest of the story would spend itself disproving. He said, "You can raise the prettiest chicken in the county, but pretty don't pay, and a slow bird is a road to nowhere." He meant it as a prediction of failure. It would turn out to be a prediction of something else entirely. June looked at him and said only, "That's one approach," and Del did not know what to make of that, and he drove off, and June went back to filling the water pans as the light went out of the sky over the western ridge. The first birds went to butcher weight in October, and this is where the second thing everybody knew for certain turned out to be wrong, because the meat of the hollow speckle was not like the meat a person could buy, and June had no way to know that until she cooked one. She roasted the first bird plain, in Verna's oven, which ran hot the way old ovens do, and she and Verna ate it at the kitchen table with nothing on it but salt, and June understood in the first bite what her great-grandfather had bled for. The meat was firm and deeply flavored, dark and rich in the leg, the way no store bird ever tasted, and there was a depth to it that made the fast, cheap bird seem like a rumor of chicken rather than the thing itself. Verna ate slowly and did not say much, and at the end she set down her fork and said that she had not tasted that since she was a girl, and that she had thought she never would again, and then she was quiet for a long time. June saved the notebook figures for the flavor, the feed conversion, the age at slaughter, all of it, and she began to sell, not in any large way. She had no license to sell processed meat across state lines and no money to build a facility, so she sold the way the old people had sold, birds live and dressed to order for neighbors, off the farm, cash or trade. And she set the price high because a slow bird cost twice as much to raise, and she would not lose money to please a man who did not understand what he was buying. The first customer was the woman who ran the diner in town, Ruth Ann, who bought one on a dare from her cook and came back 3 days later and bought 6. And the second was a man who kept bees over the ridge and traded honey for 2 birds every month. And the third and the fourth and the fifth came the way word always comes in a place like Caldwell Hollow, not through any advertisement June ever placed, because she never placed one, but through the slow, reliable machinery of people telling other people. Ruth Ann told her sister, who was married to a man who worked at the sawmill, and the man at the sawmill told the men he ate lunch with. And one of those men had a brother who cooked at a restaurant an hour east in the college town, a young cook who was always looking for something he could not get from a truck. That cook drove out to the farm on a gray Sunday in November, a serious young man named Marcus, who asked more questions than anyone June had yet met, and he wanted to know everything, the breed and the feed and the age and the way she moved the pens, and he stood in the pasture and watched the birds for a long time the way June herself watched things, and then he asked to buy one and take it back and cook it. He called her 3 days later. He said he wanted every bird she could raise, and he wanted them dressed to a size he specified, and he was willing to pay, and June sat down on the bottom step of the porch with the phone against her ear and looked out at the pasture where the last of the fall light lay gold across the flock, and she said she would let him know how it went, because she did not yet have birds enough to promise anybody every one, and she had learned from Verna never to sell what she did not yet hold in her hand. That winter was hard and slow the way winters are in the hills, and June spent it in the incubator shed because she understood by then that the birds were not the business. The strain was the business. The birds would be eaten, every one of them, but the strain had to go on, and the only way it went on was through eggs and hatches and the patient keeping of a flock she would never sell. She chose her breeders that winter the way Elias had taught her through the notebook, not the prettiest birds, but the right birds, the hens that laid the darkest and best speckled eggs on the most feed converted, the roosters with the broad backs and the good temperament, and she penned them separate and did not eat them and did not sell them, and she wrote every one down in her book with a number banded to its leg. She read Elias's notebook cover to cover a second time and a third, and slowly the abbreviations gave up their meanings to her, and she found on a back page a full breeding chart, 40 years of matings recorded in that cramped hand, and she understood that she was holding the map of a thing that had taken a lifetime to build and had very nearly been lost forever on a folding table at the county fairgrounds. She thought about Del Prather's joke about the buzzards more than once that winter, not with anger, but with a kind of wonder at how confidently a man could be wrong about a thing he had never troubled to look at. By the following March, a year after she had come home, June had a working flock of 120 breeders and a spring's worth of eggs coming, and she set the old cabinet incubators full for the first time in more than 60 years. She had learned them by then the way Elias had known them, learned to read the brass wafers by the sound of the little damper clicking, learned the moods of the shed through the seasons, and this hatch came off better than the first, near 90% of the fertile eggs, and she brooded up 400 more chicks and grew them out through the spring and summer, and she began, carefully, to fill Marcus's order. She dressed birds in a clean shed she had built with her own hands and cash she had saved, doing it small and legal and slow, direct to the customer at the farm the way the law allowed, and Marcus drove out every other week and took what she had. And he told other cooks, because cooks talk to cooks the way farmers talk to farmers. And by the end of that second summer, June had more people wanting the hollow speckle than she had birds to sell them. She raised her prices again, not out of greed, but because demand was pulling at her, and she had read enough of Elias's notebook to know that a thing raised right should be priced right, and still they came. Ruth Ann put it on the diner menu one weekend a month, and it sold out by noon both days. And there began to be, at the diner, and at the feed store, and at the gas station where old men drank coffee out of the pot for a quarter, a kind of talk about June Halloway that had turned entirely around from the talk of a year before. Nobody laughed about buzzards anymore. What they said now was that the Halloway girl had found something up on that ridge, and they said it with the grudging respect that hill people give to a thing that has proven itself with money, because money is the language in which a doubt finally admits it was wrong. June did not gloat. She had no talent for it and no interest, and besides, she was too tired most days, because a flock that size and an incubator running and a butchering shed and the breeding records all together were more work than 3 people could easily do, and she was one person with an old truck and a great aunt who could no longer walk the pasture. She hired a boy that summer, a 15-year-old named Cole from down the road whose father had lost his job at the mill, and the boy turned out to have the same quality June had, the ability to be still and watch, and she began to teach him the way Verna and the notebook had taught her. And it did not once occur to her that in teaching him she was doing the very thing Elias had asked in his one underlined line, "Tell whoever comes after." Del Prather came to the farm in September of that second year, and he did not come to buy, and he did not come to joke. He came in the evening, after the work of the day, and he stood at the gate the way he had stood 2 years before. And this time he did not lean out a truck window, but got down and walked over to where June was closing up the pens for the night. He was quiet for a while, watching the birds settle, and then he said, without any preamble, that he had been wrong. He said it plainly, the way a man states a fact he has finally made his peace with, that when she bought those eggs, he had thought her a fool and had said so, and that he had been wrong, and that he had come to say it to her face because a man ought to. June did not make him say more than he wanted to. She just nodded and said she appreciated it, and there was a silence, and then Del said the other thing he had come to say, which took him longer to get out. He had 400 acres over the next ridge, good pasture standing empty since he had sold off his cattle, and he was getting old, and his sons had gone to the cities and would not be coming back to farm it, and he had been watching what June did with her 61 acres and thinking that maybe there was more than one way for ground to be worth something. He said he did not want money for it. He said he wanted to see it used, and that if she ever needed more room to run birds or to grow out breeders or whatever it was she needed, his gate was open, and they could work out something fair. It was, June understood, an apology larger than the words he had used to make it, and she took it in the spirit it was given, and she told him she would think on it, and she meant it. She did not rush to say yes. She had learned that too, that when a thing is offered easy, you should look at it a long time before you take it, not because the offer is false, but because you should always know exactly what you are agreeing to carry. But she thanked him, and Del Prather drove home in the dusk, and June stood at the gate a while longer, thinking about how strange it was that the man who had laughed loudest was now the man offering her the most, and how little difference the laughing had made in the end. Reality had settled the argument. It usually did. Verna died in the winter of the 3rd year. She died the way she had lived, without making a large production out of it. in her sleep in the little brick house near the Methodist church, 93 years old, and June found her on a Tuesday morning when she came by with the week's eggs, and the coffee did not answer the door. There was no long illness, and no hospital, and no machinery. Only Verna in her bed, with her spotted hands folded and her face gone easy. And June sat with her a long time before she called anyone, because it seemed to her that a person who had spent 93 years never wasting a motion ought not to be hurried out of the world any faster than she had done anything else in it. The funeral was small. Half the county came, which in Caldwell Hollow counts as small, and they buried her up on the hill behind the old family place, beside Elias, whom she had outlived by more than 40 years. And June stood at the graveside in the cold, with Cole beside her and Del Prather in the back of the crowd, with his cap held against his chest. And she did not cry until it was over, and everyone had gone, and she was alone up there with the two stones side by side, the old one weathered near smooth, and the new one raw and bright. Then she cried, standing between them, and she said out loud, though there was no one to hear it, that she had kept them, the speckle, that they were not lost. And she felt foolish saying it to two stones and a cold hill, and she said it anyway because it seemed important that it be said aloud to the two people who had built the thing she was now keeping. When she went back down to the house, she got out Elias's notebook and Verna's old canvas coat, which she had taken from the brick house, and she sat at the kitchen table for a long while with both of them in front of her. And on the last page of Elias's book, below the underlined line about telling whoever comes after, she wrote, in her own hand now, the date and the count of the living flock, 430 breeders and better than 2,000 birds grown out that year, and she wrote, they are not lost, and she closed the book. That was the whole ceremony she made of it. She thought Verna would have approved of its brevity. The grief did not go away, but it settled into the work the way grief does when a person has work worth doing, and June went on into the 4th year and the 5th, and the thing she had built grew the only way she would let it grow, which was slowly and pulled by demand rather than pushed by debt. She took Del Prather up on his offer that 4th spring, not for money and not for scale, but because the strain needed room, because a breed kept in too small a compass grows weak, and she moved a portion of her breeding flock over the ridge onto his empty pasture and ran them there under Cole's daily eye. And she paid Del in birds and in a share of what the ground earned, and the two of them, the old skeptic and the young woman he had laughed at, became something like partners in a thing neither had expected. She never borrowed against the future. She grew each year only as much as the last year's earnings would carry, buying an incubator when she could pay cash for it, building a shed when the money was already in the coffee can. And there were people, city people mostly, who found her eventually and wanted to give her money to grow the thing fast and large, to build a brand, they said, to scale it, they said. And June listened to them politely the way she listened to everyone, and then declined, because she had read enough of Elias's 40 years to know that the thing that killed the speckle the first time was the very idea that faster and larger and cheaper was the only worth a thing could have. She would not make that mistake with the last of the strain. She sold what she raised, and she raised what she could raise right, and she let the wanting of it grow ahead of the making of it, because a thing that people have to wait for is a thing they learn to value. By the 5th year, there were cooks driving 3 and 4 hours to buy her birds, and there was a waiting list, and there were young people writing to her from other states, asking how they might do the same with breeds their own grandparents had let go. And June answered every letter she could, because it seemed to her that the line in the notebook did not only mean tell whoever comes after on this farm, it meant tell them all. It meant that a thing nearly lost, once found again, has an obligation to be handed on wider than one hill. She thought about that folding table often in those years, the 700 cold eggs nobody wanted, and the ring of laughing men, and she came to understand the whole matter as a kind of test that the world sets without meaning to, a thing of real worth disguised as a thing of no worth sitting out in plain view, and the only difference between the people who walked past it laughing and the one person who stopped was that the one person was willing to stand still and look at it long enough to see what it actually was. Verna had taught her that, and Elias's notebook had taught her that, and now she was teaching it to Cole, who at 20 had grown into a young man who could candle an egg and read a brass thermostat and choose a breeder as well as June herself, and who had begun, she noticed, to stand still in front of things before he acted on them, which pleased her more than any sale. She gave him the second incubator shed to run on his own that 5th summer, and she gave him a notebook of his own, blank, and she told him to write everything down, because a thing not written down is a thing that dies with the one who knew it, and she had seen how close that came to happening. Cole took the notebook and did not make much of it, but she saw him carry it in his back pocket after that, the way she carried hers, and she thought that was as close to a promise as a person of these hills was likely to make. In the 6th year, on a morning in April almost exactly like the morning she had bought the eggs, June drove into town for feed, and she came out of the store to find a young woman standing beside a car with out-of-state plates, looking uncertain, the way people look when they have come a long way and are not sure they are in the right place. The young woman asked if she was June Halloway, and June said she was, and the young woman said she had driven from 4 states away because she had heard about the speckle, and that her own grandfather had kept a strain of birds nobody kept anymore, up in the mountains where she was from, and that the last of them had been sold off when he died because nobody in the family understood what they were, and she wanted to know if it was too late, if a thing like that could ever be gotten back once it was gone. And June looked at her for a long moment, the way she looked at things, and she thought about a folding table and 700 cold eggs and a man who said they would feed buzzards. And she thought about the odds against any of it, the power failure and the dead hatchery and the lost paperwork, and all the ways the last of Elias's speckle should by every reasonable measure have ended up buried under an apple tree. And she thought about how it had not, because one person had stopped and looked. She told the young woman that it was not too late, that it was almost never too late, that the world was full of the last eggs of forgotten things sitting on tables where people laughed at them, and that all it took most times was somebody willing to stand still and see. She said, "Come on out to the farm, and I'll show you how it's done." And the young woman got in her car and followed June's old truck up the county road toward the ridge, driving slow behind her the way June had once driven slow with a bed full of straw and cold eggs. And June watched her in the mirror and thought that this, too, was a kind of hatching, a thing carried carefully forward that might have been let fall. They came up the 2-rut lane to the farm in the middle of the morning, and June parked the truck by the incubator shed, the same shed where Elias had run his cabinets and where she had sat all night on a bucket waiting for the first pip, and she led the young woman inside. And there in the warm, dim light were the trays full of eggs, cream, and speckled with faint brown flecks, the same shell Verna had held up to the barn window 6 years before and said she had not seen its like in 60 years. The young woman looked at them, and she reached out one hand and touched a shell very lightly, the way Verna had touched the down of that first chick, and she said quietly that they were beautiful. And June said, "They're worth the trouble, the others are not." And she did not tell the young woman that she was quoting a dead man's underlined line, because some things do not need explaining to be true. Then June handed her a flat of eggs to carry, and showed her how to set them in the cabinet and how to mark each one with a pencil X on one side and an O on the other, and the two of them stood together in the shed in the April light and turned the eggs. And outside on the ridge the flock of the last speckle in the world moved across Del Prather's pasture and June's own, 4,000 strong now and growing only as fast as it could grow right, the bronze roosters and the buff hens, and every one of them carrying that faint dark flecking that a man had bled 40 years to keep and had nearly lost and had saved in the end by trusting that somebody would come after and would stop and would look. June stood in the doorway of the shed a moment before she went back to work, and she looked out at all of it. And she thought that Elias would have understood it, and Verna would have said only, well, and let a bit of dust get into her eyes. If this story stayed with you, do something for me. Share it with someone who has been told that what they have, or what they are, or what they see in a thing isn't worth much, because somebody in your life needs to hear that the world is full of last eggs on folding tables, and that all it takes is one person willing to stop and look. Leave me a comment about a time you saw worth in something everybody else dismissed, or about someone who taught you to be patient with a slow and difficult thing, because I want to hear it. And tell me again where you're watching from, the town, the city, the country, the hollow, wherever this found you, because I read every single comment, and I like knowing where in this wide world these stories land. Thank you for staying to the end. That kind of patience is rarer than you think, and it is worth more than you know.